Welcome back to our mini-series on the 2001 Uprising in Argentina. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd suggest you go back and listen to that one first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
Before we start, a quick note to say that we're only able to continue making these podcasts because of the support of our listeners on Patreon. If you like what we do and want to help us with our work, join us on patreon.com/workingclasshistory, where you can get benefits like early access to ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted books, merch, and more. For instance, Patreon supporters got early access to this episode without ads, and they also get exclusive access to our 2 Patreon-only podcast series, Radical Reads and Fireside Chat. Our Patreon supporters also get access to 2 exclusive bonus episodes in this mini-series with more information and context. Link in the show notes. At the end of part 1, Thomas had just woken up following a chaotic 2-day ordeal trying to secure tickets for the final game of the Argentine football season, in which his beloved team, Racing Club de Avellaneda, were on the cusp of winning their first championship for 35 years. What Thomas had not expected, however, was that when he awoke, his city would be the epicenter of a rebellion that would shake the country's political system to its core. At the same time, during our interview, Thomas also wanted to underline that while he was in Argentina, both in the immediate lead up to and during the 2001 uprising, he was essentially quite isolated from the movement itself, having lived for so long outside of the country.
There's nothing that would make me more uncomfortable than to in any way, shape, or form give the impression that I had an organizing hand in doing the hard work, the grassroots work of organizing to prepare the conditions for that uprising. So I had this kind of unique perspective of a person who is Argentine, who is of the left, who kind of knows the structures and the peoples and the past and the battles and the etc., but who wasn't, sometimes you miss the forest for the trees. I wasn't in any organization. I wasn't in any sectarian battle because I hadn't been putting in the work. I was essentially a homegrown tourist, but who was very much willing to be like, we need people? Yeah, sure, I'll put on a mask and I'll be right there, which is how I experienced the uprising.
This isolation made things potentially quite dangerous.
This is, after all, South America, and our cops do not mess around. And I remember thinking, you don't know like where cops are, where demonstrators are, like what parts of the city are in the control of who. You're completely alone. And again, cops in Argentina can and will kill you or beat you within an inch of your life for sport. So I was like, man, this is a little dangerous. Like, what am I supposed to say? No, bro, I just showed up. I swear I haven't done anything yet. Don't hit me. It's probably not the safest way to go about things.
That being the case, and this all happening before the hyper-connected days of social media, Thomas did the only thing he could think of to find out what was going on.
So I had no better idea than to call the offices of the Communist Party of Argentina because of all the money and the influence of Moscow and whatever. They still had a few, like, pretty significant, I think they still do to this day, they have some pretty significant physical infrastructure. Like, they have a building near Villa Crespo, or in Villa Crespo, which that's got to be worth, I don't know, I'm not a real estate agent, but I would say that place is worth $300,000 to $500,000 easy. So, they have that infrastructure and they have a phone number. That's like, I'm going to call. Maybe they have somebody there, because they have an emergency meeting or whatever. And so I, in fact, called them up. And I don't know who was more surprised, if me that somebody answered the phone, or the lady on the other end that somebody was calling the party in the year 2001 asking for guidance, something that probably hadn't happened since the 1950s. But after we got past the awkwardness of it, I remember she did tell me, there's an emergency demonstration called for tomorrow at Congress.
Now, at Working Class History, we spend a lot of time talking about systemic or structural issues, social forces, etc., etc. But in history, this often just produces the conditions that make one thing or the other possible, and which themselves only become obvious in hindsight. But the spark that makes these conditions explode into specific uprisings or revolts can often be pretty random. In this case, it was that the initial battles that Thomas was watching on TV took place on a Wednesday.
Again, it's one of those things we'll never know if things would have died down definitively, because I don't think that the march of random leftists, would have been maybe enough to spark the uprising that we saw. But every Thursday since the 70s, the mothers and grandmothers of those disappeared by the military dictatorship, every Thursday morning, they get together at the Plaza de Mayo, in front of the presidential palace, to draw attention to the disappearance of their children.
These women are known as the mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo. As we mentioned in part 1, approximately 30,000 people, predominantly trade union and left-wing activists, were disappeared by the dictatorship during the dirty war of the 70s and 80s. The mothers and grandmothers protests began in the late 70s, the women wearing white headscarves with the names of their disappeared children and grandchildren on them. This was at huge risk to themselves, and some of these women were themselves subsequently disappeared as a result. Despite the return to democracy in 1983, pardon laws were passed, preventing the prosecution of many dictatorship officials responsible for torture, murder, and genocide. The mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo continued their protest to ensure that the issue of the disappeared would not be forgotten, and to demand that those responsible for the killings be punished. In 2001, these pardon laws were still in effect. That these women's protest was taking place once again within the context of a state of emergency was hugely symbolic.
And they basically walk in circles, I believe at 10 a.m. or so. And so by 5 or 6 a.m., things had died down. It was over. But a few hours later, the mothers started congregating. And as is usually the case, and especially so given the context that day, they were joined by some organizers and militants of or other organizations. So there were some younger people with them as well. But we're talking maybe 100 people. Like it was small. For some reason, I guess because strictly speaking, it was against the state of emergency, but somebody who I'm going to say was not politically terribly intelligent, because if I was a political operative on the side of the government, I probably would have said, let them do their thing. But they ordered the mounted police to disperse them. And this was broadcast live on all the TV channels, or at least the news channels. I don't know. It was definitely easy to find on live television. And it was one of the last things that I saw as I left my apartment to head downtown, was these sweet old ladies being whipped by men on horseback. And, if I was already, again, the ideological fanatics like me probably don't need too much prodding. But I think many people saw that and said, this regime, this government, this system, it's out of hand, and were drawn to action from that. So I think that mobilized a lot of people downtown and to the Plaza de Mayo and Congress area.
As Thomas says, it's difficult to know how things would have played out differently if police hadn't cracked down on this small demonstration. But these images of police attacking old women whose children had been disappeared by the dictatorship added an extra element of anger to things. This was no usual protest.
When I got to the Congress, which is where the left-wing demonstration was scheduled to begin from, left-wing demonstrations back then in Argentina weren't exactly huge affairs, and they weren't terribly combative. And again, I say that as a person who obviously comes from a very, very combative line of anarchism. And I remember pretty quickly looking around and being, oh, this is a very different vibe than what I'm used to in Buenos Aires, because all around me were hooded faces, slingshots, bars. It was we haven't come here to play kind of vibe. And I remember we headed off in one direction, which I think is the more direct route, to Plaza de Mayo, and were immediately met with just a wave of tear gas and rubber bullets. And it was like, okay, we didn't even make it out of the square that's in front of the Congress. And somehow, I don't know if it was the collective hive mind or those more organized within the demonstration, for either some of the parties or whatever, but a decision was made to turn around and go in another direction. And incredibly, we met no resistance going in the other direction. And pretty soon, let's call it, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, we were in the vicinity of the Plaza de Mayo and the presidential palace. And again, we were met with this just nonstop volleys of tear gas and rubber bullets. And I'm bad at spontaneously maybe putting it into words, but it was fighting the kind of which I haven't seen in a while. It was, you could feel the anger and the fury. Barricades were being built not just on the main street as we would advance towards the Plaza de Mayo, but on the side streets to avoid us getting flanked by police on motorbike or on horseback. It was, meter by meter. And it was this cocktail, which again, I do believe that it was this kind of mix of social and political elements that gave the day its character and made it be what it ended up being. Because on the one hand, you had kind of your couple of thousand very politicized kind of left-wing and Peronist organizers and militants and those who would, but you could clearly see people just streaming in who had seen it on TV or who were office workers. Like I remember seeing people in suits and ties who were clearly leaving their jobs or deciding to not go, I don't know, but who had not come downtown to participate in an insurrection. They had clearly come downtown to go about their daily lives, and something about what had happened made them say, today is the day, today is not a normal day. And suddenly they were, wearing their dress shirts as balaclavas. And you could feel that it was just a very broad group and a very heterogeneous group of people that was everywhere from Peronist militants to left-wing aspiring revolutionaries to office workers to disgruntled. You could tell that people had just lost their fear. It was a different animal to the kind of confrontation that I knew even from these kind of classic anti-globalization era confrontations where it's, your mob of a couple thousand anarchos. This was different.
The anti-globalization movement that Thomas mentions here was a movement at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s that saw major protests around the world against meetings held by various global trade and financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, World Trade Organization, WTO, and the World Bank. Some significant anti-globalization protests were the 1999 Seattle WTO protest, when around 40,000 demonstrators shut down the talks while hundreds of black bloc anarchists smashed shops and luxury cars in the city centre. And the 2001 Genoa protest, when around 300,000 protesters attempted to blockade the meeting, leading to heavy clashes during which 23-year-old Carlo Giuliani was killed by police. While this movement was limited in some ways, often restricted to these spectacular protests around the meetings of institutions rather than rooted in people's everyday lives, in another sense, this movement was actually quite incredible, essentially forcing the major institutions of global capitalism to give up on holding its meetings in major cities. Thomas has actually written a fascinating account of this movement in another book called Another War is Possible. We'll be sure to get Thomas back on the podcast to talk about that book as well. But in the meantime, you can buy the book in our online shop, and we'll include a link on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. The clashes in Buenos Aires, however, were on a different level to those which took place during the anti-globalization movement.
I can't, off the top of my head, go through the chronology exactly, but at some point we had either heard of that they were shooting live ammunition as well as rubber bullets, or we had already seen a body on the ground. Again, I lose track of which and how came first, but I distinctly remember that not that far into the confrontations, we had to kind of take cover every time we saw a rifle or heard rifle fire, because we no longer knew if what they were shooting were rubber bullets or live ammunition. My experience is not unique. It's literally one that was replicated by thousands of people. One way or another, you could tell that people had had enough and that fear was not so much a factor anymore. And again, I know that what I'm saying is a delusion. I know that now. But I think many of us shared in the delusion in that moment that victory of some kind was literally 200 meters away, that we were going to overrun these cops and that we were going to storm the presidential palace. I feel stupid saying it out loud now. But yeah, I mean, in those moments, it felt like victory was right there. But speaking of the delusion, the Partido Obrero, the Workers' Party, which is Trotskyist party, is one of the largest ones back then, and it's one of the main players in the Trotskyist electoral front today. Their newspaper ran with the cover a few days later or right around there. The revolution is here. At least it served to me as consolation. Okay, I wasn't the only one who thought maybe something really, incredible was happening here.
We'll get onto some of the more longer-lasting effects of the uprising later in this episode. But it's worth remembering that even if this was not the arrival of the quote-unquote revolution, incredible things were still happening right there in the middle of the revolt.
And indeed, at one point, we heard a cheer kind of go up randomly, and it was that the president had resigned. And not that much later, we heard a helicopter, and it was indeed the president being evacuated from a rooftop helicopter from the president's palace because the police considered it too dangerous to try to evacuate him by land. And again, I witnessed and I experienced some incredibly inspiring and beautiful things, such as total strangers being in solidarity with each other, people who don't know each other fighting for a common cause. I saw, bars and bar owners, opening their spaces and letting people sit there and giving them water and cleaning out their eyes. I had the opportunity of sitting. I remember at one point sitting at the, like the entrance, the doorstep to a building and chatting with some random, I'm going to say middle-aged lady, but now that I'm also a little older, I'm going to go with, she was probably 40, but she seemed like a grandmother to me back then, who was a school teacher. She wasn't some wild radical, and she had been looting, and she was talking about how she had difficulty making ends meet, and again, I forget the details, but she kind of told me her specific story of hardship of the time and how she had gotten some things to eat and some clothes and just, some things that she needed in the looting that happened. Because during these clashes downtown, there was also kind of looting in the rear guard as well. I remember seeing a guy, I don't want to stigmatize people, but I'm from that, I remember seeing clearly like football hooligan, barra brava style, like big tummy, tattoos everywhere, like a kind of guy that if you're in the wrong neighborhood and from the wrong team, I don't know about this one, going around merrily with like sweet, I don't, whatever. There's alfajores and like specific things, and just giving them to random strangers. Like, and I thought how it was illustrative of how even those most conditioned to have to fight and suffer for every little bit of material, not even comfort, but of material needs, as soon as that scarcity disappeared, the dude was cutting cake with his keychain and giving it to people. It was those kinds of inspiring scenes.
Given the severity of the clashes, however, it's unsurprising that not all of Thomas's memories were so inspiring.
Now, they literally existed almost side by side, and that's why I always say, this hope and death, beauty and despair, all these things, in the case of revolutionary struggle, they tend to exist as two sides of a very, very fine line. They're not on two distant opposites of a spectrum, because I have those memories just as I have memories of a lifeless body on the ground and people crying and yelling and screaming desperately. And that's just the one that I saw. And of the guys on motorbikes saying, hey, you need to be careful because there's civilian cars just randomly pulling up and shooting out of cars. And also in those moments, you also don't know, like there's a lot of rumors. You don't know what's true, what's not. A lot of it ended up being true. There's literally something called the massacre of the Plaza de Mayo, and several people were killed.
The massacre of Plaza de Mayo were a series of police killings that took place on the afternoon of 20th of December 2001, in the final hours of De la Rua's presidency. With the government declaring a state of siege, uniformed and ununiformed police began firing live ammunition into the crowd, killing 5. Some of those killed were Gaston Rivas, a 31-year-old father of 3, 27-year-old Diego Lamagna, one of Argentina's top freestyle cyclists with no history of political activism, and Carlos Almiron, a 23-year-old activist in unemployed and anti-state repression groups. Argentina's most read newspaper, Clarín, described the massacre as, quote, an almost unprecedented massacre in the already violent contemporary history of Argentina, end quote.
And so most people who were killed at random, and they were killed in these kind of randomish situations around the confrontations. I make a big effort in the book to tell their stories, to tell how they died, to talk about the people, many times strangers, who came to their aid and rescue. There's one person who talks about how there was two people who were shot and lay dying, and he had to make a brutal decision, the way you would in a war, of triaging. Well, okay, there's this younger man who has this kind of injury, and there's this older person who has this kind of injury, and the older person might have kids, but who knows how long he has to live, but the younger one hasn't, and he ended up deciding to go for the younger one just because it's a person who hasn't had a chance at living that much of his or her life. So there's some brutal and vicious scenes of death and suffering, and I don't want to minimize them because they coexisted with all of this narration that I just and it's also a sign of what the state, in my opinion, what it is inherently and what it becomes explicitly when it sees itself seriously challenged. And in this particular case, the repression took 39 lives, injured about 500 people. In 2014, the Secretary of National Security and the head of police, as well as approximately 10 cops, were in fact sentenced for what was considered an illegal repression on that day. 7 others were found not guilty.
If the 2001 uprising in Argentina had only been a case of the courageous street fighting and tragic police killings of December 20th, then it would already have been an event of great historical importance. And yet, as spectacular as the street fighting may have been, the more inspiring aspects of the uprising would occur afterwards, in the mass experiments of community and workplace democracy that followed.
So immediately after the uprising, there was this proliferation of neighborhood assemblies, which were indeed as they sound. They were grassroots, directly democratic. They were often held on some strategic street corner of the neighborhood or in some social club sometimes, going back to the importance of the neighborhood clubs, in the gym of whatever social club. And the agenda, so to speak, revolved around how do we fix this or that issue with utility or that street or the other, or what families or areas are in need. These kind of barter, there was these fairs or swap meets, so to speak, where people could offer not just commodities but also services in exchange for, hey, I need this, you need that, how can we mutual aid, solidarity, etc. There was a lot of that.
In the weeks immediately following the December uprising, 20 assemblies sprang up around Buenos Aires. In the year or so that followed, this would rise to approximately 140 across Argentina, involving around 8,000 regular participants. These neighborhood assemblies would also send delegates to weekly general meetings of neighborhood assemblies known as interbarriales. As has been noted by many people, these neighborhood assemblies were extremely heterogeneous, reflecting the various class, racial and political makeups of the neighborhoods they were based in. But broadly, the assemblies all came together to discuss the country's economic crisis, calling for things like the non-payment of Argentina's external debt, more welfare and jobs, and an overhaul of the political system, which despite its democratic veneer, had been hollowed out by neoliberalism. Assemblies also produced their own journals and websites, organised cultural and political activities, and acted as a site where workers, students, unemployed piqueteros, pensioners and others could meet, discuss their struggles, and organise solidarity with each other. One assembly participant commented, quote, "People reject the political parties. To get out of this crisis requires real politics. These meetings of common people on the street are the fundamental form of doing politics." End quote. Yet these experiments in grassroots direct democracy were just one aspect of what took place in the aftermath of the 2001 uprising.
What I think is more interesting, not to underplay the importance or the significance or the value of the neighborhood assemblies, because they were indeed, I think, very interesting experiments and an incredible phenomenon. But there was also very much this, I don't know if wave is the word, but there was a significant amount of workplace and factory expropriations, where many places were closing, many owners were abandoning the workplaces or the factories or whatever. And in a lot of occasions, instead of letting them shut down, the workers took over them and continued operations. And some of these were significant, large places. Sanon, which is a ceramics maker, it exists to this day. But so Sanon is today called Fa Sin Pat, which is short for Fábrica Sin Patrones, which is Spanish for factory without bosses. And it, at one point, for sure employed at least 400 people. And if it's self-managed, is employed even the word? I don't know. 400 people worked there.
We're going to take a quick ad break now. If you'd like to listen to these episodes without ads, then join us on Patreon, where you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free, plus get access to our 2 Patreon-only bonus episodes for this mini-series, as well as our 2 Patreon-only series, Radical Reads and Fireside Chat. These episodes are only made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So if you like what we do, then join us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. The takeover of the Zanon ceramics factory was in many ways the forefather of the wider Argentine factory takeover movement in that period. Their struggle actually predated the uprising, as the owner, Luis Zanon, despite receiving millions in corporate subsidies, still ran up huge debts and eventually declared the factory unprofitable. In response, workers took over the factory, arming themselves with slingshots and marbles to defend the site from police incursion, which they would go on to do 6 separate times, often with the support of thousands from the local community. After taking control of the factory, workers had to go from just doing their own jobs to running the entire factory themselves, which was a huge learning process. One worker, Julian, recounted, quote, "We also had to learn a lot of new things which we had not done before. We have developed hidden capabilities which, previously, if at all, we only showed in our families. This creativity is suppressed if a boss gives you orders all the time, demands more and more but gives nothing back. Then you keep to yourself and think, I will not give him more. In this period, all the creativity blossomed, the pleasure to do things and learn new things. When the company had previously asked you to do that, you said, nope, I do my job, the rest is your business. I am already oppressed enough, I will not take on more responsibility, only to be slammed by you even worse afterwards. But this creativity emerged. We learned a lot." End quote. When the December uprising broke out, Zanon workers had already been in occupation for some months, and as Thomas mentioned, the factory, which is now renamed Fa Sin Pat, still exists today as a cooperative. But the movement was far from limited to just Zanon. In reality, the uprising gave momentum to what would turn into a wave of factory takeovers.
There was the Hotel Bauen, which was a relatively well-known, important hotel in downtown Buenos Aires with something like 130 workers. There was Bruckmann Textile Factory. There was a chocolateria, I don't know how to say that in English, a place that made chocolates. And there's much more that I'm forgetting. And many of these, just to be clear, it wasn't short-lived, couple months experiments. We're talking years on end. We're talking struggles to eventually obtain the legal expropriation of these properties, which Sanon/Fa Sin Pat did obtain. Again, in my opinion, and it's what makes this uprising so relevant, is that not only did thousands of people see what collective power can mean in practice as far as on the streets and as far as taking on a government, but thousands and thousands of workers also saw, okay, this talk from the left-wing crazies of we can actually run our places of work democratically and take decisions over our labor relations is not some fairy tale fantasy. It's an experience that now in Argentina, thousands upon thousands of workers have had in their lives.
While it's hard to get a precise idea of how many workplace takeovers there were at the time, estimates for the year following the December 2001 uprising range between somewhere around 100 to 150 workplaces put under workers' control, with the number of workers involved totaling many thousands. These collectivized workplaces came together under the banner of the National Movement of Recovered Enterprises, which still exists today, and in 2022 involved 400 workplaces and a total of around 15,000 workers. In many ways, this is similar to what occurred during the Portuguese Carnation Revolution of 1974-75, which is the subject of episodes 41 and 42 of this podcast. These workplace takeovers and neighborhood assemblies meant Argentina became something of a laboratory for anti-capitalist politics. These radical political forms were summed up in one of the famous images from the period, with a banner holding the movement's slogan, "They all must go, government of the workers and the neighborhood assemblies." But, as Thomas mentioned, they did not succeed in storming the presidential palace, and this government of workers and assemblies never came to pass. However, the uprising did usher in a new period of politics in Argentina, sometimes called Kirchnerism, in reference to the government of the left Peronist Nestor Kirchner, followed by that of his wife Cristina, which lasted from 2003 to 2015. This period was a very contradictory one for Argentina's working class and social movements.
Between the uprising itself, between the loss of legitimacy of established power and established parties, between the neighborhood assemblies, the worker self-management experiences, the bar, etc., all of this put together, because after the uprising and after kind of capitalist bourgeois power reconstituted itself, I think a lot of us had this feeling of, we failed. It was all nice and good, but clearly we failed. But what it took us a little longer to see and to identify, and maybe even to accept as something positive, which in my younger radical self, maybe, I didn't see incremental advances necessarily as something positive. I would have only viewed them as escape valves for capitalism, things that make it possible for capitalism to continue existing. But all of this put together in Argentina, what it did is that it very, very clearly, dramatically pulled the Overton window of what was acceptable, public discourse, et cetera, to the left. And it's what made possible the Kirchnerist government from 2003 forward. Well, back then, we had established this common sense consensus basically around social justice, that there needs to be a redistribution of wealth, the role of the military as something inherently negative and dangerous to society, that repression is something to be avoided, because most of society, there was a general consensus that this is a bad thing. And the Kirchnerist era, had a lot of things that I think would have been impossible without the process of the late 90s that culminated in 2001.
One of these measures was the overturning of the laws pardoning crimes against humanity carried out by the dictatorship, opening the door to prosecutions of some former officials.
There was the legalization of same-sex marriage. There was legislation passed to protect indigenous languages and tongues in Argentina. Again, there was a repression against an indigenous nation, where one thing does not eliminate the other necessarily. There was an attack against the media monopolies from the government to try to break them up. I understand, again, if I had lived in Argentina, I would have been in opposition to that government and not. But, and it is in the book, Kirchnerismo did actually incorporate large parts of the piquetero movement in a way that, just as Perón saw that he needed to assimilate the trade union movement to guarantee governability in Argentina in the 50s and 60s, Kirchnerismo understood, okay, the unemployed workers organizations, we need to assimilate them and make them part of our power structure if we are to solidify power. And they did that, and they actually, at one point in my research, I started trying to find out, okay, what happened to a lot of these people, the organized anarchists who were active in that period. And in fact, some of them did end up being consumed by the left of center, left-wing Kirchnerism. So I hope it wouldn't have been how my political activity ended, but I feel like I'm not in a position to judge them. People will get angry because they'll point out the repressive laws passed by Kirchnerism. They'll point out, and again, obviously, it's a center-left government. It's not an anarchist utopia. But we do need to be clear. Not everything is the same. It's not black and white. And I think the fact that there was that space obviously had a lot to do with 2001. There was even things which, to bring us back a bit to football and soccer, which people are like, oh yeah, bread and circus. Yeah, of course. But for example, we had something called Fútbol para Todos, soccer for everybody, which was basically the government saying soccer is an important part of the cultural identity of Argentines. It shouldn't be behind a paywall. And so there was no pay-per-view soccer for many years. It was free for everybody. Yeah, of course, this serves the government. Yeah, of course, it's bread and circus. But if I forget those strategic things, in principle, am I against this for any reason? No, of course not. Why would I be against it? Culture should be accessible to everybody.
As Thomas explained, the Kirchnerist era was a paradoxical moment for the Argentine working class. On the one hand, it did see real improvements in ordinary people's lives, such as around social welfare, healthcare provision, and pensions. But on the other hand, the period also saw the incorporation of social and workers' movement organizations into state bureaucracies, demobilizing the very movements that won those improvements. This is actually a frequent problem that social movements come up against. That is, when movements become powerful, how do they resist the pitfalls of integration into the system they're in conflict with? The socialist thinker Leo Panitch noted this tension in his essays on the integration of trade unions into national-level institutions decided on economic policy. For Panitch, rather than bringing class struggle into the heart of the state, this top-level institutionalization served to consolidate power with union bureaucracies and away from the grassroots, and it pushed union leaderships to promote policies like wage restraint to members and develop mechanisms for disciplining the rank-and-file militants who opposed those policies. Now, Panitch was writing about trade unions in 1960s Europe, particularly the UK and Sweden, but while it might not all apply to the experience of early 21st century of Argentina, it does show that the tensions and contradictions of state integration are nothing new.
I think the grassroots and politically independent structures that grew out of it gradually withered away, so to speak. A lot of it became institutionalized, was captured by the structures of traditional state infrastructure. And again, a lot of it withered away as the material conditions for people improved. And again, it's always controversial as an anarchist or as a radical to grant that systems which aren't those that we want can provide material improvements, but capital always recovers. It's never enough to wound it. If you wound the interest of capital, they will come back sooner or later, like, forgive the redundancy, like a wounded, violent beast. And I think that's a big part of the difficulty of the opponent we face, is that when capital is wounded, and by wounded I mean pushed back and concessions are forced of it to limit, how much wealth it can concentrate, how much wealth it can extract from workers, what conditions it can impose on the masses of society, etc. It will bide its time, but sooner or later it will come roaring back in one form or another, because that is the inherent nature of it. I think, regardless of the specifics of the Argentine situation, that's the broader ideological answer to what happened. We were able to keep it at bay for a while, extract concessions from it, but sooner or later it reconstitutes itself.
Gradually, Argentina's period of relatively left-leaning redistributive policies gave way, leading to the present-day crackpot politics of current president Javier Milei. Milei describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist, a term originating in the 1970s despite the fact that anarchism, dating back to the 19th century, has its roots in the anti-state wing of the socialist movement, with anarchists being instrumental in the formation of some of the world's first labour unions, including in Argentina, where for many years the most significant union was the explicitly anarchist Fora. By contrast, the only thing anti-state in Milei's so-called anarcho-capitalism is its desire to cut state support for social provision. At the same time, Milei's supposed anti-state position doesn't preclude a closeness to figures and families of the old authoritarian dictatorship. Aside from Milei's scandals involving his sister, including the accusations of corruption, though he has also previously had to publicly deny having sexual relations with her, Milei's neoliberal shock therapy approach to the economy has led to a collapse in living standards. Poverty rose to almost 53% in the first year of his presidency, an increase of over 10%. In the midst of all this, Argentina's social movements continue to mobilize. Within this movement, Thomas, now back in Buenos Aires, works as part of a project that fuses sports with radical politics called La Cultura del Barrio, which translates to the culture of the neighborhood in English.
La Cultura del Barrio, the sporting and social club in Buenos Aires. Me is exactly an example of, okay, I want to stay active. I want to continue to show that there is an alternative. There is a different way of living, of existing, of interacting with one another, of being in solidarity with one another. And I think there's an incredible value in the middle of Buenos Aires. Villa Crespo is very heterogeneous in that regard. I think it goes from working class to lower middle class to middle class. But it's a very central historic Buenos Aires neighborhood. You know, it's where the anarchist library is literally a kilometer away. Atlanta's stadium is literally 4 blocks away. But it's a space that is open to anybody, and that, unlike most spaces of the anarchist or anti-authoritarian ghetto, isn't just in theory open to everybody. It's in practice open to the neighborhood, and it has literal hundreds of dues-paying members who understand, though, that nobody will ever be turned away because of lack of funds, who use this as a space where they can do all sorts of cultural and sporting activities, from concerts to debates to yoga classes to boxing to you go in on Monday nights and there is a group of people playing bagpipes in one of the rooms. So it really is the neighborhood having a space where it's not just us giving a speech about, hey, you know, you can live differently. You know, there can be spaces that are outside of the logic of capital and commodification, where you have to spend money. It's in practice. You can go there, you can do things, you can meet with your neighbors. If you have, you know, obviously it doesn't exist for free. That's why we do fundraisers, we do a million things. But if you don't have money, nobody's going to turn you away from the door. If you want to come here and hang out today, there's no expectation of you to spend any money. And at the same time, it's an explicitly, overtly political space. You know, it looks like any of your self-managed autonomous centers in Germany or Europe would look like. There's Antifa flags everywhere. There's political graffiti. There, you know, you can't walk in and out of there and not, at the very least, by osmosis, take a little something from that. And again, I think in times where there isn't mass popular struggle, of course, there are struggles and we're involved in them, but we have to be fair and realistic as to how broad and they are and how much power they have. But in times when we don't have that, these structures are incredibly important, because they'll be the organizing basis when things turn around. We won't have to start from zero. We won't have to reinvent the wheel. We won't have to conquer physical space. We won't have to find a way to implant ourselves in a neighborhood. We've already been there, and we've been there for over a decade.
If you want to learn more about La Cultura del Barrio, we'll include some photos and links about the club on the webpage for this episode. Link in the show notes. One thing that kept coming up in our discussion with Thomas was how similar the present-day situation in Argentina feels to the years that preceded the uprising. The pursuit of a neoliberal agenda, tying its economy to the US dollar, a greatly diminished left, etc., etc. And yet, through all of that, Argentina's working class was still able to rise up and bring about real substantive change to people's lives. Also, in case you were wondering what happened to Racing Club de Avellaneda, after risking his life for those match tickets, Thomas managed to go to the final game of the season. The result was a 1-1 draw, which meant that Racing, a club which only 2 years previously was declared to have ceased to exist, won the Argentine League for the first time in 35 years. The newspaper Clarín ran the headline, El Día del Gran Sueño, the day of the great dream. In football, as in politics, 2001 was a year in which great dreams became reality in Argentina.
I gave the talks post 2001 in the US about this. I do remember that I would tear up when talking about certain aspects. I think a lot of that 20th of December, this feeling of anything is possible, and that's why the book is called A Tale of Two Utopias. Utopia is almost by definition something which you find, which you aspire to but don't believe to be achievable or realistic, suddenly it felt like it was within a few hundred meters, a half an hour, an hour. Again, I understand it was potentially a delusion, but it was a delusion. But to have lived it, whether it be for a few minutes, a few hours, is an incredible thing. And I've always been a big fan of the explicitly anarchist mobilization or riot or whatever. I come from that culture. I feel comfortable. I feel safer there. I feel like there's less chance of infiltration. But this was obviously different. This wasn't just a few hundred very ideological, committed political young people running around. This was a cross section of society. And that was different and it impacted me. But most of all, what I took from it, and I think it's what cemented my anarchism for life. But I don't know if without the Argentine uprising, I would have had the political trajectory that I had for the rest of my life. Because it gave me this idea or this knowledge, I don't know, that no matter what you're going through, no matter what we as a society are going through, no matter how bleak the perspectives, apparently anything is possible at any moment. And I don't need to be told that anything is possible at any point, or that so-called ordinary people are capable of extraordinary feats and bravery. I didn't read it in a book. I lived it. I experienced it. I saw people, like we said before, and I saw people in suits and ties face down and chase off literal armed murderers in broad daylight in the streets. And again, I travel, I'm a very international person. This could have happened anywhere in the world, but it did happen to be on the streets that I walked most in my life. And so it was even nearer to me. I saw, again, to use a cliche, but I saw that popular power make a president flee on a helicopter from a presidential palace. It's the kind of things that I read about from, I don't know, the Spanish Civil War or the October Revolution, but I saw them with my own eyes in full color. And so I think all of that to me was a very vivid illustration. And it's the reason, one of many reasons why I wanted to write this book, is that, it illustrates what happens to the human spirit immediately when, like I said before, when scarcity and competition are removed from the equation. That, even amongst those most brutally conditioned by the worst material conditions of capitalism, suddenly the driving force was solidarity, it was mutual aid, it was the beautiful things of the human spirit, not to sound too idealistic, but and again, that gave me this notion that, if I'm still an anarchist despite the horrors around us, it's because that gave me the notion that apparently there can and should be hope in any darkness. And I think that's something that's very useful in times like these ones.
Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.
That's it for the main episodes in our mini-series on the 2001 Uprising in Argentina. If you want to hear more from Thomas, we've produced 2 special bonus episodes as part of this series. One on the history and politics of Argentine football culture, and a second one where Thomas discusses various topics like the memory of the dirty war and armed struggle, as well as discussions around protest violence around the time of the uprising, exclusively for our supporters on Patreon. It is only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts, so if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, 2 exclusive podcast series, fireside chats and radical reads, as well as discounted merch and more. And if you can't support us right now, please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. Also, if you'd like to read Thomas's excellent book, Argentina, A Tale of Two Utopias, you can get yourself a copy in our online shop. Link in the show notes. And as a listener to this podcast, you can get 10% off using the discount code WCHPodcast. We'll also include a link to the webpage for this episode, where you'll find more information, including further reading, video, images, and sources. Thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible, and a special thanks to Jazz Hands. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening.
morto